Welcome to Creekside Chats with Successful Real Estate Investors, brought to you by Steve Talker Capital, promoting prosperity and harmony to help you flourish in all areas of life. Join in as we explore the motivations and goals of real estate investors and how their ability to invest abundantly has provided them with the time and freedom to contribute to the world in a creative and thoughtful way. Now please welcome your host, Dr. Allen.
Hello, Enlightened Investors. Happy to be back with you today. Dr. Allen here with Mark Pierce, who is not only an attorney, but also a CPA and business entrepreneur. As an entrepreneur, he flexed his muscles, scaling a transportation company from $3.2 million to $11.5 million in just 6 years. As an attorney, his expertise extends to securities and also mergers and acquisitions. It comes as no surprise that Mark brings extensive expertise to asset protection, with inside knowledge of the benefits of LLCs based in Wyoming, his own home state. Enlightened Investors, let's welcome Mark to the show. Mark, let's start off with sharing a memorable experience from your formative years that as you look back on it, you say, yeah, that helped me to be the person I am today.
I had, as a child growing up, my great-grandfather had formed a drilling company when he moved from Ohio after the Civil War out to the West. And beginning in the late 1880s, early 1890s, he began drilling for oil in Montana and Wyoming. Over the course of the next 60, 70 years, they built up a fairly substantial company. Unfortunately, my grandfather didn't believe in the use of attorneys. And even though my uncle and my father prevailed on him to get some estate planning done, it took him till almost the end of his life to get any advice. And he had gone to an estate planning attorney in Billings, Montana. And that individual wanted to charge in 1965 $150 an hour. My grandfather was a little circumspect about attorneys to begin with, but he would be damned if he was going to pay anyone $150 an hour to give him tax advice. So he went home and decided not to pursue anything with that individual. And so my uncle and my father lined up some additional individuals, but my grandfather never followed through with them, and he passed away about 6 or 7 months later. The result of that was that there was no will in place or no trust in place, and it ended up in a family fight. But even more predominantly, the tax issues at the time, the inheritance tax issues at the time, came due. So they ended up having a fairly large inheritance bill for the time that had to be paid off before they could sell their company. So my father and my uncle worked for 5 years to pay that off. And I can remember the night that they had the party where they had paid that off and celebrated that having happened. They then turned around and had to begin reinvesting in the capital equipment within the drilling business because over a 5-year period, they hadn't bought anything because they couldn't afford it. They didn't have the cash flow for it. They're paying off the government. With that in mind, my aunt then decided to divorce my uncle and sued to get her proportional share of the stock in the company. And my uncle decided he didn't want to pursue working that hard any longer. So it came down to my father buying them out after he had just bought out the government from the other half of the business. So he said that was enough. So he declined and they sold the business and divided up the proceeds. That was about 1972, 73 by the time those things had gotten taken care of. And 73, they sold the company. Over the next 7 or 8 years, the value of oil went up exponentially several times. And as a result, they left a lot of money on the table from an 80-year-old business that should well have gone into their own pockets, to the family pockets. Consequence of that was that I was able to pull myself up by my bootstraps and get on, but my cousin and his family never were able to overcome that. And they're still struggling to this day. And that was 50 years ago. So that's when I became interested in tax planning and estate planning and the practice of law and also the practice of accounting.
It's a good lesson to learn at a young age and has obviously served you quite well throughout your life.
Today's show is the last show for Creekside Chats with Successful Real Estate Investors. We're moving to a new label entitled Real Estate Investing Abundance. The new show will continue bringing you, our guests, personal stories of inspiration and will also bring to us their knowledge and wisdom gained from their extensive investment experiences. On June 14th, you'll find us for our premiere show at Real Estate Investing Abundance. Look for us on your favorite podcast app. I look forward to meeting you there as we learn and grow together and become more enlightened as investors to build passive streams of income for financial independence and time freedom to live abundantly.
Let's get into this process of the syndication. And from a legal standpoint, how is it that LLCs can provide protection to syndications? And particularly, why is it that Wyoming is a preferred state for asset protections?
The LLC, limited liability company, is something that was put together by attorneys and estate planners in the state of Wyoming. Wyoming is the first state to recognize a limited liability company. And they did so at the behest of something called the Wyoming Estate Political Action Committee, which was a consortium of top flight attorneys, accountants, and banks who selected Wyoming as a way in which to upgrade the Uniform Trust Code and the corporate asset protection codes in a state within the United States rather than relying on offshore trust jurisdictions to provide those mechanisms. So they formed these LLCs to provide for enhanced levels of asset protection, both upstream and downstream, meaning a creditor of an LLC membership interest holder cannot get into the LLC, and the LLC's creditors cannot get out to the member interest holders as well. Wyoming has what they call a closed limited supplement, which allows you to forego most of the corporate formalities that pertain to a limited liability company for small family-owned limited liability companies. So it really enhances what it is that you're able to accomplish in terms of asset protection. Wyoming also recognizes single-member LLCs, which a lot of jurisdictions do not. So Wyoming has worked overtime, first of all, to recognize limited liability companies and also make them very difficult to get into and out of if you're an outside creditor. Not only that, it's very difficult to discover who the other membership interest holders are, even in the course of litigation, because we have what we call a cloaking mechanism, if you will. If you remember that from Star Wars, where the Klingons always cloak their battleships coming in, that a cloaking mechanism that says, look, why do you need to know the names of the other membership interest holders? And if you can't give a justiciable and prevailing reason as to why that is, you're not called upon to make that disclosure. So the anonymity not only exists at the public level, it exists in the private litigation level as well. So Wyoming has worked hard to get itself to the point of being at the forefront of asset protection and anonymity in the conduct of your affairs. We've also worked very hard in prevailing upon the Internal Revenue Service to adopt within its revenue code no particular LLC tax obligations or tax symbols. So at the end of the day, you can tax an LLC as a partnership, as a corporation, a subchapter S corporation, or as a sole proprietorship or pass-through entity. So we have all the tax planning that goes into it that you can possibly want, giving you all the flexibility for that, as well as heightened asset protection and anonymity.
In terms of passive investors and protecting their assets within a syndication, do they need an individual LLC to protect their own individual interests within a syndication? Or if the syndication is holding the LLC in Wyoming, is that going to give investors within those syndications the same kind of protection that they need?
Yes, if they have a membership interest in an LLC, which owns whatever projects, usually a real estate project, then those LLC liabilities within that project will not flow down to those individual investors generally. However, if you're not in Wyoming, there are states that have much less protective laws than Wyoming would have. So I think it would be in individuals' best interest to hold the membership interest in that syndicated LLC in their own LLC to make sure that they trap any liabilities that may flow out of that LLC into a separate LLC that's organized in Wyoming that will not flow out of. And there are a lot of people that use Wyoming LLCs for that purpose. So the answer to that is yes. And then also the interesting part about that is that if you had a Wyoming LLC that holds those syndicated interests and the membership interest holders have a judgment against them individually, those membership interest holders, those creditors of those members cannot get into that LLC to force a liquidation or to force a distribution out of that LLC. In addition, in Wyoming, you're allowed to make indirect distributions to subvert the creditor's judgment against that membership interest, to subvert that. For instance, let's say that you had a membership interest in an LLC that held a syndicated interest. There was a distribution out of an apartment complex of $100,000 sitting in your LLC, and you had a judgment, a tax judgment, for instance, of $250,000 against you. That taxing entity would have what they call a charging order. That charging order said in the event that there's a distribution made out of that LLC to you as an individual, you have to make it to that creditor. The LLC makes indirect distributions instead, as they're allowed to by statute. without violating that particular charging order.
It sounds like a good idea, but it also sounds like it comes with complications, and complications often come with costs. So if the property is held within North Carolina, are they going to have to form an LLC in North Carolina and then on top of that form an LLC in Wyoming? Or do they just need the LLCs in Wyoming?
I think that the syndicator in North Carolina would form an LLC in North Carolina because that's where the property is located. So it is not going to behoove them to have a Wyoming LLC owning a North Carolina property, because the court in North Carolina is probably just going to apply North Carolina to law to the Wyoming LLC anyway. It seems to make sense because the asset's in North Carolina and they have an overwhelming interest in doing so. But you as an investor in that syndication, I think it would be your best interest to form a Wyoming LLC to take those distributions out of that North Carolina LLC.
Okay. So you're recommending that they form the LLC in whatever state the property is in. In most syndications, there's going to be at least two LLCs. There's going to be an LLC for the sponsors, and then an LLC that's going to hold title and also is going to be where the investors are going to be. That would be the simplest of commercial syndications. So where does the Wyoming LLC come into that? We're going to say that this property is in North Carolina.
Let's say that you have a North Carolina LLC that owns that property. They're going to have membership interests in that LLC. So that membership interest would be held by a Wyoming LLC as to those investors who want to be able to prevail on Wyoming law to protect their own individual assets. So typically when they do their subscription agreements, they would say, okay, we've got North Carolina LLC issuing a 2% membership interest to ABC, a closed Wyoming limited liability company together. So it'd just be a direct subscription in that manner. We find that a lot of clients will come in on syndicated interest. Wyoming has more LLCs than it has people. So there are a lot of people who, and we get referred a lot of business from out-of-state attorneys who said, look, I've got a client who needs an LLC for these purposes. Would you put it together for them? So we do that. And then we house the LLC here through a registered agent agreement and a office rental agreement. So they domicile the location of their LLC here. So at the end of the day, what ends up happening is that those funds transfer into a Wyoming company. The Wyoming has no state income tax. They do, of course, have federal income tax, but it flows out to the individual who owns that syndicated interest. So what they'll do is that they say, look, this group of syndicated interests we want in this type of LLC, these groups of syndicated interests we want in these LLCs, and it has to do with asset types. It has to do with the inherent risk to the limited liability company and the people they're dealing with. So it's more of an individual choice that's made by that individual's attorney and accountant as to how they hold the interest or where they hold the interest or how to separate those entities out. So there's a lot of criteria that go into the assessment of that.
I understand that it is actually possible to form a Wyoming LLC within just a matter of an hour or two of an attorney's time. Is that correct? And if so, how does that actually work?
We've reduced the process to an order sheet. So in many instances, people will book a time with me for half an hour and discuss what their goals and issues are, go over a sheet, and then I refer them to our online source. They fill out the appropriate form, and then we form the LLC based on that. And we have software that we've developed over the past 5 years. We've got in cash well over $1 million invested in it. And it interfaces not only with the Wyoming Secretary of State, it also interfaces with the Internal Revenue Service, so that if the name's available and that name availability is checked by an individual, we can't do that in an automated process. But if the name's available, and it typically is, we can get that LLC formed well within an hour. And we can also get an EIN well within an hour as well.
Enlightened investors, are you passionate about the work of your calling but have little time to develop a passive investment portfolio to secure your future? Even though you are blessed to work in your calling, would you like to have financial freedom to live more abundantly in all areas of life? If this is you, visit us at steedtucker.com. There you'll find free information on predictable, reliable, and passive real estate investing so you can develop financial independence for abundant living. While there, you can schedule a 30-minute phone call to talk with me about anything you'd like, or if you'd rather, send me an email at alan@steedtucker.com. I look forward to meeting and connecting with you. Let's go back to the syndication process and say we have the property in North Carolina, and so we're going to have a North Carolina LLC, and that LLC is going to be the title holder of the property. Then we have a sponsorship LLC that we're going to say that there's 5 sponsors within that LLC. And then we're going to have an investor LLC that is going to have, say, a couple dozen investors. So just give us a short overview of how you would recommend that entire syndication to be structured.
Yeah, on the investor LLC, you're anticipating upwards of, say, 20 to 50 investors coming in, or whatever your numbers are going to be. So that investor LLC will issue membership interests out of it as a question of how you want to have that held. So you as an individual as an individual membership interest holder would tell the investor LLC, this is how I'd like my LLC interest to be held. That's typically where you come in within a Wyoming LLC. Now on the North Carolina entity that owns the title, you then have that out to a sponsorship LLC. Is a sponsorship LLC, when you refer to that, is that the individual LLC that manages that property? And it's sort of like a family office, but on a larger context.
Right. Yeah, it would be the management team.
Yeah. So they get a percentage of the cash flow that comes from that. Then anything that goes beyond that would flow indirectly to the investor LLC, and those would be the net proceeds. Those are all disclosed up front, so you can articulate generally fairly well, unless you're doing construction within the North Carolina title entity, you can articulate fairly well what the cash flow is going to be with your working capital reserves coming off of that. So you can anticipate what it is per year your cash flow is going to be, what the depreciation overflow is going to be, and what your tax liability is going to be. So you would want to have on the North Carolina entity, you'd want to flow through into that investors LLC of all the tax benefits that accrue from that. So I would think at that point in time, you'd want that investor LLC tax as a partnership. So all those benefits flow out to that investor LLC and you get enhanced deductibility. I would imagine during the first 5 to 10 years, you're probably running at a negative basis, depending upon how you structured it. Typically cash, but sometimes a combination of cash and debt, depending on what goes on. So you'd flow those partnership interests out to those individuals after about, I would say probably about, what is it? Your flip usually about 10 to 12 years on these with a 25-year event horizon?
It's generally about 5 years on a flip property.
Okay, so 5 flips. So at some point in time, you're going to have this excess overflow of cash. So this becomes your next North Carolina title entity, doesn't it? Because you've done such a good job. In 5 years, you give them, say, look, you got this much cash coming out. You're going to need to shelter that from income. We can roll it into the next partnership at that point. So that's how I'd structure it, typically as a partnership.
You've talked about how the passive investor can protect themselves. What I understand is that you're suggesting that each one of those passive investors have their own Wyoming LLC rather than investing directly as an individual. Is that your recommendation?
Yes, it is. One of the reasons for that, and we discussed this before we went on the air here, but we had gone into the necessity of estate planning. And if you have real estate interests that are held independently in an LLC, and that LLC is held by a family trust, then when you pass away, that trust dictates where those assets go. And you can protect your offspring, or you can protect your spouse during the course of your spouse's lifetime from liabilities, from usurpers, basically, who come in and try to take that money away. Failed marriages being a huge issue with your offspring, or second marriages. If you die and your spouse elects to remarry or bring somebody in on an independent non-marriage basis, whatever you want to call that, you need to protect your estate for the benefit of the people who you care for, not from somebody who may come in from the outside. You also need to protect from tax liabilities, because kids sometimes have issues with taxes. They don't pay them, or they underpay them, or they get involved in issues, let's say, over a period of time, which can come on. They get divorced, they have failed businesses. All of these you can protect them from if you have the appropriate trust structure. And the trust would own that LLC that is invested in those investor LLCs. So that's a real add-on benefit for these people. It's a lot easier to transfer LLCs than it is to provide for the transfer of individual membership interests within these investor LLCs in a probate format. Because if you had, let's say that you had invested in 20 of these investor LLCs, each one's held by you individually. In the event that you pass away and you don't have a trust or a will in place, you have to go in and you have to file for an informal probate. You're going to have to pay an inventory tax on each one of the values of those LLC interests, which will be fairly easy to articulate, but it does take time. And then you're going to have to pay an attorney, an accountant, and basically the judge to go in and say, this is how you would like these things devolved out. And one of the interesting things is for clients is that you have a deceased spouse, widow or widower come in, and they think that their spouse passed away, so everything naturally goes to them. Well, that's not the case. Generally, under state statutes, half will go to them and then half goes to the deceased spouse, kids, offspring. So who's going to be, and is there an antagonistic relationship between those two parties? So it can get pretty bloody in court sometimes. So those are the issues that you leave outstanding that you should address in advance. And I think that's another one of the advantages to those LLCs.
If I understand you correctly, it is much easier when we're dealing with ascendancy to deal with an LLC than it is an individual, because the LLC has the operating agreement and is going to have ascendancy already spelled out, whereas an individual may not. But that's probably not the end of asset protection. And you had mentioned family trusts and living trusts. Talk to us about what trusts are, how do trusts differ from LLCs, and how does that provide an additional level of not only protection, but also an additional level of directing ascendancy?
As I discussed earlier, when the Wyoming State Political Action Committee chose Wyoming essentially to go in and upgrade and to make it what Sam Western from The Economist magazine has termed the only onshore-offshore trust jurisdiction in the United States. What they did is they had LLCs work in tandem with the trust laws to make the two function together. The LLCs take the operating entities and put them into the operating assets and put them into the LLCs. The trust itself is an anonymous document that's not filed anywhere. The trust itself is a contract, and it's a contract between the trustee, a contract with the settlor or the person establishing the trust, and it has an asset that goes into the trust. Those are the three elements to a trust. So the trustee may or may not be the beneficiary of the trust, and if in an asset protection context, who generally will not be, there's a way around that as well, that allows you to transfer assets into your trust, protect those assets against the creditors of your spouse, the creditors of your offspring, but also over a period of time, generally around 4 years, from your own creditors. So you can have self-settled asset protection trust for your benefit. And through the use of Wyoming statutes, you can put together a private trust company that allows you to control almost every aspect of that trust indirectly through that private trust company so that you don't lose control over your own assets. You just put them into a vehicle that protects yourself from your creditors as well. So you put them into that vehicle, you run that vehicle, and you begin to acclimate your children and your spouse to what goes on within the operations of this trust. And then when you pass away, you make sure that the trust is divided up in a certain way to meet what the goals and aspirations that you have for your children. Some kids need more help than other kids do. So you structure your trust to provide for your spouse after you pass away, or for yourself after your spouse passes away. And then they go as you dictate after you've both passed away. And typically what you'll end up doing is you pass those assets down to kids in another spendthrift trust, so their spouses can't get to it, the government can't get to it, and any creditor failures, business failures, those creditors can't get into it as well. One of the interesting things in the United States is that I think it's 5% of the people in the United States die with some sort of estate plan into effect. 95% have nothing. Half the people in the United States don't really need anything, but the other half do need something. And people have a tendency to think that, why do I worry about it? The reason you worry about it is because you leave your kids, you leave your spouse with a shoebox full of information that you know everything about, and you'd be surprised by how little they know about it. They just are not interested, or they haven't been paying attention every time you brought it out. If you put it into a box and you have that box managed by individuals who are capable of managing that box, then the transition during the time that after you've passed away to the devolution of those assets out to the people you want them to get, it's a fairly straightforward transition. And it takes all of the emotional harness off of the people at the time that you want them to be involved with the true emotions, mourning your passing and getting along with the rest of their lives without having to fight and squawk over what the assets are about or trying to find them. I know that when my parents passed away, it took me almost 5 years to straighten that. So you're taking that onus off of the kids.
Well, let me just sum this up, be sure that I get this correct. In terms of asset protection, the first place to begin is with your attorney. The next thing you want to do is to be sure that you have your assets protected within the Wyoming LLC, because Wyoming offers the best protections within the country. The second thing you want is a trust that holds the LLC. With those three layers of protection, the attorney, the LLC, and the trust, you've essentially done pretty much all you can to protect your assets as well as to create a line of ascendancy. Am I summing that up correctly?
Perfect.
Okay, Mark, share with us how it is that our viewers and listeners can get in touch with you so that they can take advantage of this asset protection.
The easiest way to get in touch with me is to go to wyomingllcattorney.com, book an appointment, or talk to some of our customer service representatives about what it is you anticipate your issues being. They'll take you as far as they can go as far as a unlicensed legal advisor can take you. And if you get beyond a certain point, they'll refer you over to me. You can book a half hour or 1 hour consultation. We can go over what your family structure is about, what your asset structure is about, what would work best for you. And then we can put you onto a planning process at that point. And I think that a lot of people don't realize how straightforward it generally can be. I know that their family situations can be very complex, but there are legal solutions to them.
It does sound complex, but that's what attorneys are here for. Let's go into our final round of questions. What is your best advice for the busy professional and successful entrepreneur who is interested in investing in passive real estate syndication?
Find a group of syndicators who are honest and successful.
Very good. That's my exact advice as well. So I second that. There's all kinds of operators, and your best avenue is to find someone who's got the experience and expertise and has a good record. So what is the worst one thing a passive real estate investor should avoid?
Oh, I would say if you're just starting out being a passive investor, I think the thing that you need to avoid is focusing on you need to focus on the rate of return. Don't get me wrong. It has to be a fair rate of return given the amount of investment that you're making. And your investment should always be straightforward. And I'll give you an example. There was an individual who had invested with Bernie Madoff, but he and his 4 friends didn't have enough money individually to invest with Madoff. So they lied on their subscription agreement to put the money together to invest with Madoff because they thought the 11.5% was just great. So it was too good to be true, and they lied to get into it. Be honest with yourself. What sort of risk are you willing to undertake? Do you know much about this investment? If not, start slow, get your feet wet, and basically step up over time. And also learn to understand, and you will understand within about 3 to 5 years, what are they actually saying when they say these things? Because you've developed your own language in these terms over a period of time, and it becomes second nature to you, but to a new investor coming in, it's not. And I just can't emphasize enough that you've got to have people who are involved with you, willing to speak with you, and are going to treat your money as if it were their own. And that's the best advice I can give.
Excellent advice. A lot of times people think that the level of risk has to do with their boldness as opposed to their timidity, but the level of risk has to do with how much money can you actually lose without hurting your financial well-being. I appreciate you sharing that with us. What do you wish I had asked you that I haven't asked you?
I think one of the things that I find to be very interesting in this is that when you have an individual who's investing passively from time to time, real estate or anything else, what's their relationship with their family? Where do they want to take all of this over a period of time? What are your goals? And my son and I were talking the other day about the crazy cat person. When you have 17 cats, maybe you're not quite crazy, but when you have 18, is that the tipping point? And so at the end of the day, if you've got $5 million in the bank, are you at a tipping point, or is it 10 million? Your tipping point, what do you need to live? And it seems to me that what you want to imbue your family with is the idea that you should give something back. So once you meet your financial requirements to say, I'm living, the kids are educated, we're provided for into the next generation, or not, or maybe we shouldn't be, who should we give the money to? And to establish within the framework of your estate plan an active participation in giving. So that would be my suggestion.
My last question is, imagine that you have lived a rich life and meaningful life, and now you're on your deathbed. As you reflect back, what memories fill you with happiness, pride, and satisfaction?
Oh, friendships, community, family, those sorts of things. That's what gives you the joy. You got the right to life. What is it? Pursue life, liberty, and happiness. What do they mean by happiness? And the psychologists have come out and said, happiness is the people you're around. So and that falls right back into the giving. How much do you need? not a function of the money, it's a function of who you're involved with.
There was one question I did want to ask you. How did your back injury save your life?
After graduating from my undergrad, I went to work for a drilling company in Houston, and I was in their management training program. And I was working offshore, and I hurt my back. And I had wanted to I was with the Glomar Coral Explorer, which was a global marine vessel at the time. They were subsequently bought out by Santa Fe Industries. They transferred that over to the South China Sea to drill exploratory wells there. We drilled wells, but we always capped them. We didn't produce anything because it was just an exploratory vessel. This vessel in 1979, 1980, it cost $100 million 50 years ago to build these things, 40 years ago. Anyway, I couldn't complete the management training program because of a bad back. And so I thought, well, I want to continue with an office job doing what the back office of an offshore drilling company does. So I went to law school. I went to law school in late August of 1980. And I think it was in the spring of 81 that the the Coral Sea was sunk in a typhoon off the South China Sea. So, as well as a couple of friends of mine, and they've been on the ship. So bad back saved my life.
I'm glad it did. And it changed the course of your life as well.
I think from what I've just noticed, I've always thought that investing in real estate is like watching paint dry. And I think that for a lot of people, passive investing in real estate with a reputable company is an excellent way to get involved in real estate. And I find that unless you're willing to get in with a significant amount of properties over a fairly short period of time, it's just not worthwhile. And I see a lot of these people say, I'm going to start with a 4-plex. Within 5 years, I'll be up to 100 units. And you go, not from what I've seen.
Yeah, and oftentimes they're not making the return on investment that they think they are because they're not counting their labor, because it takes a significant amount of time, effort, and energy when you're working at that level. My advice to anybody wanting to invest in real estate is to go into it as a passive investor and let the professionals who know how to syndicate and know how to put it all together to be the ones to do the work. You get much, much, much better returns on your investment than trying to do it individually. And it doesn't take that much money. There are ways to do it with good returns without wasting your precious time. And the people who are the listeners on my show are people who are involved in their professions and they don't want to leave their professions because they went into their professions because that's where they find fulfillment and rewards and happiness. But they do want a place to invest their money outside of Wall Street. So I appreciate you being on the show, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again, Alan.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for joining us on Creekside Chats with Successful Real Estate Investors, brought to you by Steed Talker Capital. For more information, as well as access to our free ebook on enhancing your well-being through real estate investing, be sure to connect with us at steedtalker.com. As part of our efforts to make the world a better place, Steed Talker Capital contributes to activities and organizations committed to better understand the equine and enhance the humane treatment of horses worldwide. Steed Talker Capital, working for a world where all creatures, great and small, flourish abundantly. Connect with us at steedtalker.com.